There are places where time seems to stop, like the little wooden cabin our family rented, tucked quietly at the edge of a forest, where bird song echoes louder than any car. Everything was rustic, peaceful, until Karen showed up. She didn't knock, she didn't ask, she didn't smile. She stormed across our lawn like she was carrying out a Senate-level raid, mouth shouting, fingers pointing, eyes brimming with judgment. She wasn't a town official. She wasn't a friendly neighbor. She was a self-appointed cop, judge, and jury, all rolled into one very tight yoga outfit and a conviction that she was always right. To her, context didn't matter. She didn't care why we were here. She didn't bother to ask why my wife, a veteran, and now a public defender, had chosen this remote spot to rest after months of brutal court cases. All Karen saw was strangers, out-of-state plates, and that was enough for her to act. She didn't need evidence. She had a feeling. We thought, maybe she was just lonely, afraid. Maybe the world was changing too fast, and she was clinging to something familiar. But when she started snapping photos of our car, held her phone up to my wife's face, and barked, "You're trespassing in a regulated community," all empathy evaporated. My wife didn't react with anger. She stood still, eyes steady, unflinching. The calm of someone who had faced judges, juries, and unjust systems for far too long. Karen didn't know how to handle that. She thrived on submission. She expected the people she challenged to bow their heads. But here stood someone, unafraid. Karen moved in closer. "I'll call the police," she threatened. "I have the right to question anyone suspicious." That line, my wife had heard it too many times. From cops, from bigots, from people who use the law as a weapon. But she also knew this. Sometimes, resistance doesn't come with shouting. She calmly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folder. In the middle of the forest, under bright golden sunlight, she slid out a single piece of paper, crisp, stamped, signed. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was a reverse warrant. Karen froze. The chill didn't come from the forest wind, but from the moment she realized she was now the one under scrutiny. That paper was no bluff. It was legal, enforceable, and built upon multiple complaints from residents who had grown tired of her surveillance, her harassment, her racially tinged vigilance. From where she stood, her self-image cracked like glass. She stood motionless, lips trembling but silent. Gone was the righteous fury. All that remained was fear. No one yelled, no one pushed. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a folded paper, in the steady gaze of a woman who no longer has to prove her innocence. And in that moment, I saw something rare. Karen finally felt what so many people, like my wife, have felt their entire lives. The weight of being presumed guilty. This wasn't just about a neighbor and a visitor. This was a story about power in the wrong hands, about control wrapped in morality, about a society where some people believe they represent the law just because they think they should. But this time, the actual law spoke, and it didn't speak for her. Karen, real name, Hoa Trin, was once an administrative clerk at the county office, retired for nearly a decade now. She lives alone in an old colonial-style house with a white picket fence and flags that stay up all year. Online, she has no profile picture. But in this town, everyone knows who she is, and everyone has a story about her. She once called the cops because my son rode his bike without a helmet, a father told us. She secretly filmed a brown-skinned family barbecuing in their backyard and sent it to the HOA, said another, his anger barely contained. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Story after story, eerily similar. Hoa showing up where she wasn't needed, inserting herself into others' lives, always wielding the rules to control, not out of care, but because she thrived on power. The power to judge, intimidate, and play neighborhood law enforcement. But this time, she picked the wrong person. Weeks before our trip, my wife, ever suspicious of coincidences, began digging. A few phone calls and some patience were all it took to uncover the truth. Hoa wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She had previously been warned by local authorities for illegally placing no trespassing signs on a public walking path near her home. She had impersonated a community safety officer to threaten Airbnb guests she claimed were culturally incompatible with the town. And disturbingly, she had a long history of calling 911 whenever she spotted a suspicious stranger, almost always someone with darker skin. Over an 18-month period, she made 23 emergency calls. Not a single one led to charges. My wife compiled records, interviewed residents, pulled public data. Each fact connected. Each coincidence dissolved into a clear pattern. This wasn't just behavior. It was a system, fueled by fear, prejudice, and a sense of unearned authority. And now Karen, no, defendant Hoa Trin, would finally face real consequences. The civil harassment warrant wasn't just paper. It was proof that justice still exists, even in forgotten places. A signal that society still allows room for reasoned resistance. She may have yelled at kids in parks. She may have logged license plates just because she felt uneasy. But this time, she can't yell. She can't film. She can't hide behind, "I was only trying to help." Because now, the truth doesn't need her permission to exist. How could someone behave like this for so many years without being stopped? Is this just one person? Or the tip of something much deeper, more dangerous? Karen's story didn't end when the warrant landed in her hands. That moment wasn't closure, it was ignition. A chain reaction began to unravel, shaking the foundation of this quiet little town. Days after that confrontation, the letters started coming in. Not from Hoa herself, but from those who had long stayed silent. A single mother wrote that Karen had called the police 3 times on her son just for playing shirtless in their own backyard. A young couple said she anonymously reported them for cultural incompatibility with the community, simply because they had tattoos and spoke Spanish. They hadn't dared to speak up before. They were afraid of retaliation, afraid of being that neighbor. A few had tried to file complaints, but were met only with polite shrugs from local officials who encouraged peaceful resolution within the community. In other words, no one really did anything. Gradually, an invisible map came into view, a nameless web of control where people like Hoa Trin quietly played the role of moral gatekeepers, empowered not by badges or uniforms, but by a watchful gaze and a smartphone. They didn't need handcuffs. They didn't carry batons. They wielded something subtler, more insidious, the power to define who belongs and who doesn't. The deepest wound wasn't the harassment itself. It was the constant anxiety, the creeping sense that someone was always watching, not through security cameras, but through a pair of cold eyes, waiting for you to slip up, to step out of line, to be made an example of. We received more than 20 stories in just 1 week. Testimonies from the elderly, immigrants, queer folks, people of color. Each one carried the same thread. They had been made to feel unwelcome, policed, and exhausted by Karen, or someone just like her. And the consequences? Not everyone has the strength of someone like my wife. A boy who was screamed at by Karen for being too loud in the park refused to go outside all summer. A Chinese-American fruit vendor, fully licensed, perfectly legal, Had to move out after she called the police on him 5 times in a row. Every time he was doing nothing wrong. They didn't want to fight. They just wanted peace. But in a place like this, just wanting peace becomes a deliberate surrender. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Not Karen's shouting, but the silence of those around her. They saw, they knew, but they didn't want the trouble. They turned away. They said, "It's probably not that bad," until it happened to them. So how do we dismantle this web of control? Can one person spark real change? Or do we need something bigger? After the flood of stories, the quiet tears, the nervous glances away from the camera for fear of drawing more attention, my wife and I knew we couldn't just walk away. We couldn't let someone like Hoa Trin be the face of community order. We couldn't let suspicion win over a handshake. We couldn't let shouting drown out reason. So my wife organized a small-town gathering, right at the same cabin where weeks earlier Karen had stormed in like a thunderstorm. But this time, people came on their own terms, eyes no longer lowered. They told stories. They cried. They named the fear they had kept hidden for so long. At that meeting, 3 things were agreed upon. 1. A civil response network would be created, where residents could share experiences of harassment without fear of isolation. Not to accuse, but to connect and protect. 2. A formal petition would be sent to local authorities demanding the establishment of an independent oversight board, separate from the HOA, to investigate citizen abuse of authority. No more yoga pants vigilantes, enforcing their own laws. 3. Every resident must take responsibility to speak up when something is wrong. No more turning away. No more saying it's not my business. No more waiting for someone else to stand up first. Because if one woman, like my wife, could silence a Karen with a single sheet of paper, then dozens, hundreds can force an entire shadow system to take a knee. We don't need to scream to reclaim justice. We need to be consistent, organized. And most of all, we must no longer stay silent. Karen didn't disappear, but she was no longer the phantom looming over this town, and more importantly, she was no longer untouchable. So if someone's ever made you feel like you didn't belong, don't blame yourself. You have the right to be here, the right to speak, the right to live without asking permission. If you're in a community where surveillance has become a way of life, be the one who disrupts that life. Form a group, call your friends, share this video. Start with a meetup, a message, a petition. Because justice doesn't just appear. It arrives when someone refuses to stay silent.